Imagine the first light of dawn breaking over the English Channel. A blood-red sun creeping above the horizon, painting the underbellies of 1,000 bombers in hues of gold and crimson. For the men of the United States 8th Air Force, it is the most beautiful and the most terrifying sight they will ever see. Beautiful because it means they have survived another night. Terrifying because it means they are about to fly into hell again. But for one B-17 pilot on this morning of March 4th, 1944, the real nightmare would not begin over the target. It would begin on the return journey, when his aircraft would betray him in the most fundamental way possible. When the hydraulics failed at dawn, this pilot's belly landing would become the only thing standing between his 10-man crew and a fiery grave. The date is March 4th, 1944. The target is Berlin. The long-awaited daylight assault on the heart of the Nazi Reich has finally begun. For months, the men of the 100th Bomb Group, based at RAF Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk, have been preparing for this moment. They are known throughout the 8th Air Force by a grim nickname earned through catastrophic losses, the Bloody Hundredth. And on this morning, as they climb into their cold metal fortresses, they know the odds are stacked against them. But what they do not know is that for one aircraft, Honey Child, the greatest threat will not come from German flak or Focke-Wulfs. It will come from a failed system at 20,000 feet and the steady hand of a 22-year-old pilot from Ohio who refuses to let his men die. To understand what happened that morning, we must first understand the machine they flew and the men who flew it. The B-17G Flying Fortress was the culmination of years of design and combat experience. By 1944, it was the most advanced heavy bomber in the world. Its hydraulic system was a marvel of engineering, a network of high-pressure lines and actuators that controlled the landing gear, the flaps, the brakes, and the gun turrets. Without hydraulic pressure, the massive main landing gear, each wheel the size of a man, would not lower. The flaps that slowed the aircraft on approach would not deploy. The brakes that stopped 25 tons of metal on the runway would be useless. The bomber would become a glider with no way to slow down and no way to stop. Pause. The pilot of Honey Child was Lieutenant James Douglas Wilson of Columbus, Ohio. At 22, he was young to carry the weight of 10 lives, but he was already a veteran. He had joined the Army Air Forces straight out of college, driven by a sense of duty that defined his generation. His crew was a cross-section of America, a farm boy from Iowa in the ball turret, a Jewish kid from Brooklyn on the radio, a former insurance salesman from Chicago in the nose. They had trained together for over a year, flown together through flak and fighters, and developed the unspoken trust that binds a bomber crew into a family. They called their fortress Honey Child, named after the sweetheart the pilot had left behind. The 100th Bomb Group had earned its grim nickname through sheer mathematics. In the brutal air battles of 1943, the group had lost so many aircraft that replacement crews arrived faster than the names could be painted on the wall of the officers' club. Regensburg, Munster, Bremen, each mission had carved a notch in the group's soul. By March 1944, the men of the Bloody Hundredth were not naive. They knew the statistics. They knew that the average bomber crew had a 1 in 3 chance of completing a 25-mission tour. But they also knew that quitting was not an option. The war demanded their best, and they gave it, mission after mission, loss after loss. The target for March 4th was Berlin itself. The Big B. The city that Hitler had sworn would never be bombed by daylight. The mission was a massive undertaking, over 500 bombers from multiple divisions, escorted by the new P-51 Mustangs that could finally take the fight to the German fighters all the way to the target and back. The briefing at Thorpe Abbotts was tense. The intelligence officer pointed to the red line on the map stretching deep into Germany. The room was silent except for the scratch of pencils on kneeboards. The chaplain said a prayer. The men walked out into the cold dawn, climbed into their fortresses, and began the long wait for the flare that would send them into the sky. By 0600 hours, the engines of Honey Child were coughing to life, one by one, clouds of blue smoke billowing across the hardstand. Lieutenant Wilson ran through his pre-takeoff checks, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. Oil pressure, fuel flow, magnetos, all in the green. The hydraulic pressure gauge showed a steady 1,000 pounds per square inch. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be. At 0620, the green flare arched into the gray Norfolk sky. The massive bombers began to trundle toward the runway, their weight compressing the tarmac. Honeychild lifted off at 0635, joining the endless stream of fortresses assembling into combat boxes over the English countryside. Pause. The climb to altitude was a familiar routine. The crew donned oxygen masks at 10,000 feet. The temperature inside the fuselage plummeted to 30 below zero. Frost formed on the inside of the windows. The gunners test-fired their .50 calibers, the deafening roar confined within the aluminum tube. Below them, the English coast slipped away, replaced by the gray chop of the North Sea. Ahead lay the Dutch coast, and beyond that, the flak and the fighters and the long, grinding journey to Berlin. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 0900 hours. Almost immediately, the first German fighters appeared, specks on the horizon that grew into the unmistakable silhouettes of Focke-Wulf 190s. But this time was different. This time, the American escorts were there. P-51 Mustangs dropped their auxiliary tanks and dove into the German formations with an aggression that surprised even the bomber crews. Wilson watched from his cockpit as a 190 exploded in a ball of flame, its wreckage tumbling past the formation. The intercom crackled with excited calls from the gunners. For once, the fighters were on their side. The formation droned on, battling through patches of light flak and sporadic fighter attacks. By 10:30 hours, they were approaching the IP, the initial point, where the bomb run would begin. Wilson could see Berlin ahead, a gray smudge on the horizon, obscured by the black puffs of heavy flak that filled the sky like a thunderstorm turned inside out. The bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft shuddered as the bombs fell away. Target covered. Now came the long turn for home. It was on that turn, as Honeychild banked away from the burning city, that Wilson first noticed something wrong. The hydraulic pressure gauge, which should have held steady, was flickering. The needle danced erratically, then began a slow, inexorable drop. 900 psi. 800. 700. Wilson called his co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Barnes. Check the hydraulic panel. We're losing pressure. Barnes confirmed it. There was no visible leak, no warning light, no indication of where the fluid was going. It was just disappearing, draining away into the unknown systems of the aircraft. At 600 psi, the first system failed. The power turrets stopped rotating. The gunners would now have to crank them by hand, a nearly impossible task in the thin, freezing air. At 400 psi, the flaps became unresponsive. At 200 psi, the landing gear indicators went dark. By the time Honeychild crossed the German coast heading west, the hydraulic pressure gauge read 0. The needle rested on the peg, and Wilson faced the terrifying reality. He had no way to lower his landing gear, no way to deploy his flaps, and no way to brake once, or if he ever got back on the ground. Wilson's voice remained calm on the intercom. He had been trained for emergencies. He had practiced simulated hydraulic failures in the flight simulator back in the States. But the simulator had never included a freezing cold fuselage, a crew of 10 scared young men, and a 25-ton bomber running low on fuel over the North Sea. He told his crew the situation straight. The hydraulics were gone. They would have to land without wheels. It was called a belly landing. And if he did it wrong, the aircraft would cartwheel across the runway, explode on impact, or simply tear itself apart with all of them inside. Pause. The crew absorbed the news in silence. In the ball turret, the farm boy from Iowa felt the aircraft lurch and realized he was trapped in a plexiglass bubble with no way to get out until they were on the ground. In the radio room, the kid from Brooklyn began quietly organizing the emergency gear, his hands shaking as he checked the survival radios and the first aid kits. In the nose, the insurance salesman stared at the endless gray water below and thought about his wife. They all thought the same thing. Would they make it? As Honeychild limped across the North Sea, Wilson's mind raced through the options. He could order the crew to bail out. But bailing out over the North Sea in March was a death sentence. The water temperature would kill a man in minutes. He could try to make it to a base in East Anglia and attempt the belly landing there. But without flaps, his landing speed would be dangerously high. Without brakes, he would have no way to stop once he was down. The runway at Thorpe Abbotts was long, but was it long enough? He did the mental calculations, running the numbers again and again. It was going to be close. Too close. The radio operator picked up the homing beacon from RAF Thorpe Abbotts. 20 minutes out. Wilson called his engineer, Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, and told him to go back to the radio room and prepare the crew for crash landing. Kowalski moved through the fuselage, his voice steady as he relayed the instructions. Assume crash positions, remove flak vests to reduce weight, secure all loose equipment. The men nodded silently, their faces pale behind their oxygen masks. At 1,400 hours, the English coast appeared through the haze. Wilson could see the green fields of Norfolk, so peaceful below, so utterly indifferent to the drama unfolding 5 miles above them. He began his descent, throttling back the engines, feeling the heavy aircraft sink beneath him. Without flaps, he had to maintain a higher airspeed to avoid stalling. 140 miles per hour. 150. The runway at Thorpe Abbotts was straight ahead, a thin ribbon of concrete carved out of the farmland. He could see the emergency vehicles already moving into position, their lights flashing. They knew. They knew he was coming in without wheels. Pause. Wilson called the tower. Thorpe Abbotts, this is Honeychild. Hydraulics complete failure. Landing gear cannot extend. Request emergency landing clearance. We're coming in hot. The tower responded immediately. Honeychild, you are cleared to land on runway 23. Emergency crews standing by. Good luck. The final approach was the longest minute of Wilson's life. He held the B-17 just above stall speed, fighting the controls that felt heavy and unresponsive. The runway rushed up to meet him. He could see the fire trucks, the ambulances, the men in their yellow slickers waiting for the crash. He thought about his crew, Barnes beside him, gripping his seat, Kowalski in the radio room, bracing the men, the kid in the ball turret, curled up on the floor. He thought about his girl back home, the one they named the plane for. And then he thought about nothing except keeping the nose level and the wings straight. The ground came fast. Too fast. At the last second, Wilson pulled back on the yoke, flaring the aircraft just enough to lift the nose. The belly of Honeychild slammed into the concrete with a screech of tearing metal. Sparks erupted behind them like a 4th of July rocket. The aircraft skidded down the runway, shedding pieces of aluminum, the sound deafening inside the fuselage. Wilson fought to keep it straight, using the rudder, using everything he had. The end of the runway rushed toward them, and still they were moving, still they were sliding, with no brakes, no way to stop. For 3 eternal seconds, Wilson thought they would overshoot the runway and crash into the hedgerow beyond. The B-17 showed no signs of slowing. The concrete was rough on the bomber's belly, grinding away the thin aluminum skin, but the massive aircraft had momentum, and momentum is a cruel master. Wilson could see the emergency crews diving for cover as the runway ran out. He braced himself for impact. And then, finally, mercifully, the friction took hold. The bomber slowed. It lurched, groaned, and came to a stop with the nose hanging over the grass at the far end of the runway, mere feet from disaster. Pause. Silence. The same eerie silence that always follows a crash. The engines coughed and died. Inside the fuselage, no one moved. Then, one by one, the crew began to stir. Voices crackled over the intercom, shaky but alive. I'm okay. I'm okay. Is everyone okay? The ball turret gunner pulled himself up from the floor, his face white as chalk. The radio operator stumbled toward the escape hatch. The bombardier climbed out of the nose, his hands trembling. 10 men. 10 men alive. 10 men who had just faced death and walked away. Outside, the emergency crews swarmed the aircraft. They sprayed foam around the engines as a precaution, though there was no fire. The crash trucks circled like worried mothers. And the ground crew, The men who had sent Honey Child into the sky that morning stood in stunned silence, staring at the wreck of their airplane. Because wreck it was. The belly of the B-17 was shredded. Great gashes ran the length of the fuselage. The metal was peeled back like the skin of an orange. The ball turret, still retracted, was scraped flat on one side. The propellers were bent backward, their tips curled from striking the concrete. By any reasonable measure, Honey Child was a write-off. But as the crew climbed out through the escape hatches, as they stood on the runway in the cold March air, counting heads and checking for injuries, something remarkable happened. Lieutenant Wilson walked around his aircraft, running his hand over the torn metal, and he realized that the main structure was intact. The wing spars, the backbone of the bomber, had survived. The engines, though damaged, might be salvageable. The aircraft had not broken its back. It had not burned. It had simply survived. The initial inspection by the base engineering officer was grim. "She's done," he said, shaking his head. "We'll strip her for parts." But Wilson refused to accept it. He had flown this aircraft for months. He had trusted his life to it, and it had brought him home. He argued with the engineers, pointing out the intact spars, the relatively undamaged cockpit, the fact that the engines could be replaced. The engineers were skeptical. They had a war to fight, and repairing a belly-landed B-17 was not in the manual. But Wilson was persistent, and eventually, his argument reached the group commander. Pause. Colonel Thomas Jeffrey, commander of the 100th Bomb Group, was a practical man. He had seen hundreds of bombers destroyed, hundreds of crews lost. But he also understood morale. If his men saw that a belly-landed fortress could be repaired and returned to the fight, it would give them hope. It would tell them that the airplane they trusted could survive almost anything. He overruled the engineers. "Fix it," he said. "I don't care how long it takes. Fix it." And so began one of the most remarkable salvage operations of the war. The ground crews of the 100th Bomb Group, already working 12-hour shifts to keep the bombers flying, took on the challenge of resurrecting Honey Child. They jacked the aircraft up on heavy timbers, the same way their counterparts in Suffolk had done with Sir Baboon Magoon months earlier. They removed the damaged engines one by one, using cranes brought in from the depot. They patched the belly with sheet aluminum, riveting thousands of hand-cut pieces into place. They replaced the propellers, the ball turret, the landing gear doors. They worked in the cold, in the rain, by day and by floodlight at night. The crew of Honey Child watched from the sidelines, grounded by the loss of their aircraft. They helped when they could, fetching tools, holding flashlights, doing whatever was asked. The bond between aircrew and ground crew, always strong, grew deeper with each passing day. They were no longer just pilots and mechanics. They were partners in a shared mission, to bring this bird back to life. By early April, the work was nearly complete. The new engines had been test-run, their roar echoing across the base. The patches had been smoothed and painted. The landing gear, now functional, had been raised and lowered a dozen times. On April 10th, a test pilot took Honey Child up for a brief flight. The aircraft handled perfectly, as if the belly landing had never happened. That afternoon, Lieutenant Wilson climbed back into the cockpit he had left a month earlier. He ran through the checks, started the engines, and taxied to the runway. The tower cleared him for takeoff. He pushed the throttles forward, and Honey Child lifted into the sky reborn. The resurrection of Honey Child was more than a salvage operation. It was a statement. In the harsh calculus of the air war, where bombers were expended like ammunition, the decision to repair a belly-landed aircraft sent a powerful message. Every airplane, every crew, every life mattered. The ground crews who had worked through the cold nights understood this instinctively. They were not just fixing metal and rivets. They were restoring hope. Pause. For Wilson and his crew, the return of their aircraft was a homecoming. They had flown other bombers in the weeks since the crash, temporary assignments that felt foreign and unfamiliar. Now they were back where they belonged. Honey Child was patched and scarred, a living testament to survival. The ground crew had painted a small emblem on the nose, a pair of crutches, a joke about the bomber's near-death experience. The crew loved it. It became their badge of honor. But the story does not end there. In the months that followed, Honeychild flew mission after mission. The crew counted them off, 20, 21, 22. Each time they returned, they touched down gently, grateful for the wheels beneath them, grateful for the brakes that stopped them. They never forgot the day the hydraulics failed, but they refused to let it define them. They were a combat crew, and combat meant pressing on. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Honeychild was part of the massive armada that supported the landings in Normandy. They bombed German positions behind the beaches, watching the thousands of ships below, knowing that history was being made. In August, they flew missions in support of the breakout at St. Lo. In September, they bombed German supply lines during Operation Market Garden. The patched bomber kept flying, kept fighting, kept bringing them home. By October 1944, Wilson and his crew had completed their 20th mission. They were done. They had beaten the odds, survived the statistics, and earned their ticket home. On their final mission, they flew Honeychild one last time, circling the field at Thorpe Abbotts before handing it over to a new crew. Wilson climbed down from the cockpit for the last time, ran his hand along the patched belly, and walked away. He never forgot that aircraft. None of them did. The new crew took Honeychild on its 26th mission, and its 27th, and its 28th. The bomber that had nearly died on a runway in March kept flying, kept fighting, kept proving that resilience was not just a human quality. It was a quality of the machine, too, a testament to the engineers who built it and the men who fixed it. On December 31, 1944, Honeychild took off on its 35th mission. The target was a rail yard in Germany. The weather was bad, the flak was heavy. Somewhere over the target, the bomber was hit. This time, there was no coming back. Honeychild went down with all hands. The new crew, the men who had inherited the patched fortress, did not survive. It was a brutal end, a reminder that in war, there are no guarantees. But the legacy of the aircraft lived on in the men who had flown it first, the men who owed their lives to a pilot's steady hand and a ground crew's determination. Lieutenant James Douglas Wilson returned to Ohio after the war. He married the girl he had named his bomber after, raised a family, and rarely spoke of his experiences. Like so many veterans of the air war, he carried the memories quietly, locked away in a place that only other veterans could understand. It was not until decades later, when his grandchildren asked about the war, that he began to share the story of that March morning when the hydraulics failed at dawn. The crew scattered across the country after the war. The farm boy from Iowa went back to the land. The kid from Brooklyn became a teacher. The insurance salesman from Chicago actually sold insurance. They stayed in touch, the way men do who have faced death together. They held reunions, looked at old photographs, and remembered. They remembered the cold, the fear, the deafening screech of metal on concrete. And they remembered the moment they walked away alive, against all odds. The 100th Bomb Group Association preserved the story in their archives. In the museum at Thorpe Abbotts, now a peaceful memorial to the men who flew from its runways, there is a display dedicated to the salvage operations that kept bombers in the fight. Among the photographs and documents is a small notation about Honeychild, the B-17 that was belly-landed, repaired, and flew 34 more missions. It is a footnote in the larger history of the Bloody 100th, but for the men who lived it, it is everything. No medals were awarded for the belly landing. There was no official recognition, no citation in the records. In the vast machinery of war, such events were common enough to be unremarkable. But for Wilson and his crew, the recognition they received was more meaningful than any medal. It was the recognition of their comrades, the men who knew what it meant to face death and refuse to accept it. It was the knowledge that they had done their jobs, done them well, and brought each other home. The story of Honeychild is a microcosm of the air war over Europe. It is a story of technology and terror, of skill and luck, of the thin line between life and death that every bomber crew walked on every mission. It is a story of the unsung heroes on the ground, the mechanics and engineers who worked in freezing cold and pouring rain to keep the bombers flying. And it is a story of the human spirit, the refusal to give up, the determination to survive against impossible odds. When the hydraulics failed at dawn, one pilot's belly landing saved his entire crew. But the saving did not end there. It continued through the weeks of repair, the months of missions, the years of survival. It continues today in the memories of the families who owe their existence to that moment, and in the quiet gratitude of a nation that remembers what these men did. The recovery of Honey Child from the runway at Thorpe Abbotts remains one of the most remarkable stories of survival and salvage from the Second World War. It is a testament not only to the skill of the pilots who flew these machines, but to the unsung heroes on the ground, the mechanics, engineers, and airmen who worked in freezing conditions to give a bomber a second chance at life. Their determination kept planes in the sky and crews in the fight. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.